Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Illuminating Systems Change. My name is Elle Richards and I'm one of the manager of cities at Vibrant Communities here. I've been in position since January, so I haven't met everyone, but I'm excited to get to know everyone as the months go on. And just to remind you that if you can mute yourselves as you come on the line, there will be opportunity to unmute yourself afterwards and ask some questions. And if you are having any issues viewing the presentation, a copy will be emailed to you afterwards. Okay, so today's webinar is about systems change, and it's going to touch on a lot of other important points and important areas of work for many of you. So it's well established in the world of social change that lasting solutions require systems change. Still, how systems change is understood can vary, and often interpretation is limited to change in government policy and practices. 6 conditions of systems change, the model which casts a broader lens on systems change. This webinar will focus on applying the 6 conditions of systems change to collective impact work, and we'll cover the use of this model as a framework. The presenters will share their experience of applying it in relation to Winnipeg's TRC 92 initiative on Indigenous Youth Employment and engaging in an employer consortium model. We hope that this webinar touches on points of interest and offers insight into how the approach can be applied to other poverty reduction initiatives. So today's agenda will cover introductions to our speakers today, and then they will do a presentation and take us through their practical experience of applying this framework. And then we'll have lots of time at the end, hopefully, for some questions. And then we'll have some closing announcements before finishing up today. So I'm happy to introduce today's speakers for our discussion today. Pam Svensson is the Executive Director of the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council, and Erica Weeb is the Collective Impact Facilitator with the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council. So a little bit of background on Pam. As the director of the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council at the United Way Winnipeg, Pam leads the team providing backbone support to the Poverty Reduction Council. Pam began her career as a community public health nurse in Winnipeg's inner city, and most recently served in a number of senior management positions at the City of Winnipeg before coming to the United Way. Erica has spent 27 years working as a community development worker in Winnipeg's inner city and with the government of Manitoba's program called Neighborhoods Alive. In her position with the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council as a collective impact facilitator, she coordinates the advancement of the TRC 92 Youth Employment, the current WPRC initiative. So now, I am going to hand this over to Pam and Erica, who will take you through their presentation, after which we'll have time for questions.
Thanks so much, Elle. Hi, everybody. This is Pam speaking, and I'm hoping you can hear me. If you can, just please do interrupt and let me know. Happy to Erica to share with you a little bit about the initiative that we're working on and how we've worked to use the 6 conditions for system change model. My task at the beginning of the presentation is guide you through the first few slides and just give you a little bit of background into the Winnipeg Poverty, how we got to where we are today. So I'll try and do that very quickly so we can really get to the meat of the system change discussion, and Erica will take you through that piece. So just to get started, Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council, some of you that you've had a chance to connect with over the past couple of years will know that we are, or maybe if Ellie, if you could advance to the next slide. The Poverty Reduction Council is an initiative of United Way Winnipeg, and it's right now comprised of 40 senior leaders, and these senior leaders are individuals represents a range of sectors from our community, including business, government, health, all those things that you see listed on the slide. We're very fortunate that we have this very diverse group of individuals coming to meet at the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council table, and with active involvement of each of them, and in particularly business, both in the large-scale business in Winnipeg and smaller-scale business traditions of commerce. The goal of the Poverty Reduction Council, and it's been in place for about since 2007, is to come together as a collective to address the underlying causes of poverty. And the premise in this leaders together is that no one sector can successfully address the complex issues of poverty alone, and that it really does take that collective effort. The approach of the council over the last many years, or the last few years, is that they do have a comprehensive strategic plan, or what they call their framework for action. And it has 10 priorities for action, including addressing housing, security, employment, all of those things. There has been and very
Sorry, Pam, can I interrupt for a moment? Your audio is sounding a little bit unclear. It's a little bit
I'll try and get
choppy. Is there something maybe happening in the background?
Is this better?
Ah, that's much better, I think.
I'm talking closer to the microphone. Maybe that'll.
Okay.
Okay, apologies on that, everybody. So the approach of the council is, over the last few years, is really built on something that we've talked about through the Cities Reducing Poverty network, and that's taking a deep dive on one or more of the aspirations at a time, as opposed to try and pushing forward on all 10. Can I get you to go to the next slide? So for the past few years, the focus of the Poverty Reduction Council has been on the aspiration of independence through income. And the thinking around that is that if you can have an impact on income, that you can have a significant impact on a number of the other aspirations, whether that's housing, food security, those sorts of things. So back in 2006, the council, 2016, thank you, Erica. The council made a decision to focus on independence through income and instructed Erica and I, as the backbone support, to go into the community and do some consultation.
Pick my family up from the airport.
And what we heard from through that consultation with community was very much an affirmation of, yes, focus on independence through income was the right way to go, and encouraged us to look at some of the demographics for our city and structure our approach based on that. So you'll see some of those key findings that we were able to pull together. Winnipeg is a city with a very young and rapidly growing Indigenous population, with a very high unemployment rate for that population. We also heard, though, as we were talking with community, that there was a number of community organizations that were doing job training for Indigenous, and one of their challenges was finding jobs or placements for youth, whether it was on a temporary basis as part of an internship program or a permanent job after they finished their training. Also, in speaking to business, our Poverty Reduction Council table, when they talked about youth employment, they recognized the need in our city to engage Indigenous youth in employment opportunities, but they weren't quite sure how to do that. They weren't quite sure how to connect with that opportunity. So what we saw was an opportunity for the Poverty Reduction Council to perhaps work to build some connections between youth, community organizations training youth for employment and looking to secure and support them in finding jobs, and businesses looking to engage Indigenous youth in their organizations. So you'll see from the next slide that we structured an initiative based on 3 strategies. And this, right at the same time that we were doing this, it coincided with the release of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Report and the 94 calls to action. And in looking at call to action number 92, we saw that it aligned very much with what we were hearing from the community and what we were looking to do in terms of youth employment. So our 3 strategies looked at, and this was very much guided by call to action number 92, it looked at how could we support education for the private sector, for businesses in terms of Indigenous history, and how could we look at workplace education and support businesses in undertaking workplace education as was called for in call to action number 92. And thinking back to what we were hearing from business and from community organizations training youth, how can we work to facilitate some new connections for employment between those different sectors? So the next slide, you'll see that we tried to structure what we called our theory of change. And what came out of this is that if you look at the private sector on the right-hand side and community organizations and Indigenous job seekers on the left, how can we work to facilitate connections between them? And what we came across was all those things in the middle, the things that we needed to consider. You'll see there the business-to-business learning that was called for in call to action number 92. Focus on learning about the truth as it related to reconciliation efforts, but and a number of the other things in that diagram. The thing that stood up for us, though, was very much that transition support, and that's what Erica's going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. On the next slide, it talks about the approach that we decided to use based on that theory of change. We were very fortunate to have one of a business leader as part of our council that was very active on not only in the council, but very interested in this work in the community. And he came forward, and he was a former Chamber of Commerce in Winnipeg, and is now had taken on a senior leadership role in one of the organizations that the organization is based in Winnipeg. And his idea was that maybe we look at using a consortium model, an employer consortium model. And that would involve bringing together businesses that were interested in taking action, as described in call to action number 92, and working together to make connections with Indigenous youth. So we started, and this diagram is intended to show, we started with, we called it a general business employer consortium, and we reached out to our business contacts.
Maybe next week.
And in the community, and we were just thrilled that initially 12 businesses responded and
More time.
With an employer consortium. So we've been working with that group of businesses, and we're now.
I don't know. I personally would wait for her to contact you, but
We're down to 9.
Sorry, excuse me. I think that one of the callers is not muted, and we can hear some background conversations. Okay. Do you mind muting yourself, please? Thank you.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if that was just me hearing that or everybody. So we've been working with an employer consortium, 9 companies. They're very diverse, and we've been meeting with them for a year or more. It was that group of companies that helped us to understand that before they moved forward on making connections with Indigenous youth and organizations that were training them, that they needed to educate themselves on the concepts of truth and reconciliation. So we've really spent the last year plus supporting those organizations in undertaking educational opportunities and learning more about the history of Indigenous people in our community. The vision for this employer consortium model is that it's scalable, that even though we've started with this general purpose consortium and we're learning how that works and how that business-to-business learning might be best undertaken and supported, the idea is that we would be able to start more consortiums and support them in similar sort of work. So just recently, we've been able to bring together a construction sector-based consortium and are finding that while their needs are very different in terms of how they work and the types of skill sets and interested youth they're wanting to connect with, their need for education initially is very similar. So that's where we're at with the employer consortium model. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is Erica now taking over. This diagram is just sort of to give you an idea of the flow of how things have gone since we started in 2016. As Pam said, the approach we're taking is very much an iterative process, learning as we go, uncovering barriers, and engaging in problem solving related to real-time experience. We understand that the Indigenous job seeker population is distinct from the mainstream job seekers in that Indigenous job seekers are much more likely to face barriers such as those related to intergenerational trauma and lack of opportunities that they've had for education and jobs, as well as barriers within our existing systems, within our workplaces, etc. So there are barriers there, and we understand that we need to take this slowly and learn as we go. So that's why we're taking this iterative, learn as you go kind of a process. So in 2016, it was very much a formative year. We started to recruit some community leaders. 2017 was really about intensive work with the businesses. So as Pam said, we've been really fortunate to have this business leader who's really championed this whole thing. That's made a huge difference for us. We were able to recruit these employers. We started to have working meetings with them. And most importantly, we started to have learning sessions for them about Indigenous history and legacy. We've really found that, you know, on that previous diagram where we had the community organizations on the one side and the private sector employers on the other side, the major focus of our work is really with the businesses. The community organizations are doing their work, their expertise, they have expertise in that area. We don't really need to do a lot of work there. Our major focus is working with the businesses. Then in 2018, we were able to start building those connections to the community organizations. First of all, to the leadership there, between the businesses and the leadership, and then of course with the participants, with the job seekers themselves. We did that through various means, which we'll tell you about a little bit later. Some of the companies started to work on that workplace education within their own companies. There's barriers related to that. It's not so easy to incorporate a comprehensive education program within some of these large corporations, but we're trying to help them work through that. So, and then at the end of 2018, we recruited this new construction sector consortium. And now in 2019, we're just continuing to build on that. And actually in a couple of months, we plan to have a public event where we are going to reach out to the business community across the city, bring them together, tell them about this initiative, and hopefully find to engage a lot more of it. One thing I want to say, we are using a developmental approach, development evaluation approach, excuse me, and one of the models we're looking at within that is the Kirkpatrick model, which we learned from Mark Debauge actually. And so that is allowing us to track, of course, not only the end result, but also what are we learning as we go along, and most importantly, how is behavior changing as a result of what we're learning. So in the box in the lower right-hand corner there are some of the numbers related to that. Not high numbers at this point, but that's to be expected. This is a slow iterative process. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is the diagram. This is the model, the systems change model from FSG in the United States. They created this, and that we came upon some months ago. We didn't set out to fashion our initiative after this model at all, but we looked at it and we just thought that it just fits really well with what we're doing. I think this model says that although when we think of structural change, we usually think in terms of policies, practices, and resource flows only, that if we do that, if we limit it to those three things, we are less likely to create sustainable long-term solutions, and that there are other conditions that we need to address as well. And we certainly agree with that. We have found in our initiative that that's very true. So they define systems change as shifting the conditions that are holding a problem in place, and they put forward these 6 conditions for systems change, ranging from transformative at the bottom to structural change at the top. Yeah, so we agree that that attention needs to be paid to all 6 of these. This model sort of reinforces our initiative. In our experience, addressing the bottom 2 rows helps to create the conditions for changing policies, practices, and resource flows. FSG, I don't think necessarily says that it's a bottom to top kind of process, but in our experience, that has been the case, and we'll talk more about that as well. So we have found this to be a helpful lens through which to view our initiative. It also has helped affirm why it takes such a long time, because it's not just about changing some policies and practices and injecting some more money. It's a little deeper than that, and it goes to relationships, power dynamics, and mental models. And one final word on that, we see mental models as changing people's minds, building awareness about issues. Yeah, basically creating learning, new learning about issues that will then impact ability to get involved in the issue in a deeper way. Okay, next slide. So again, these are the 3 strategies, which we built on call to action number 92. And first of all, we need to say that call to action number 92 itself aligns very strongly with those 6 conditions for systems change, because it addresses everything from education, relationships, equitable access, and for training and jobs, talking about how you need to look at your systems and how they are creating equitable access to training and jobs. So it aligns, the call to action itself aligns really well with those 6 conditions. But this just, this diagram just sort of indicates how those 6 conditions relate to our 3 strategies. One final word on this before we move on. We would say that the policy and practices conditions, those 2 conditions, are relevant on different levels. Like they are, so for one thing, community organizations that train youth for jobs can look at their training and say, are we providing the right kind of training for the job needs in the business field? Are we focusing on the right things in our training? The businesses can look at their HR policies, their human resource policies, and ask themselves, are these aligning? If we want to engage Indigenous job seekers, are these aligned with that goal? And then, of course, there's the broader systems such as governments and funders that also come into play when we look at policies and practices. Next slide, please. So I think we want to focus just the rest of our presentation on our lessons learned so far as they relate to those 6 conditions for systems change. And first and foremost, starting again at the bottom of that inverted pyramid, changing mental models is possible and can be transformative. First of all, we want to say that in our relationships and conversations with Indigenous leaders, we learned very quickly that if you want to talk about reconciliation, you have to precede that with the truth. And so it's important to learn the truth about Indigenous history in Canada before you move on to taking actions related to reconciliation. And we have just been very gratified that that when we provide education opportunities for these businesses, it has profound effect. And you can't, these are CEOs of major companies in Winnipeg, but you can't assume that they have had the correct information about Indigenous history any more than anybody else. But once they learn that information, very quickly their perception is broadened and changed. And in the end, their first instinct after learning about this is a feeling of urgency to want to act, want to do something about it. So we have found this learning to be key for developing a firm commitment to this initiative. We're also really fortunate here in Winnipeg to have some strong education opportunities through our Indigenous partners. We have the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation based at the University of Manitoba here, and they've been very helpful for us as far as providing these education opportunities. So when we follow up with participants after these sessions, they use words like life-changing, and it's been very powerful. So again, this is the piece around mental models, and we see it as foundational for the work that we're doing. Next slide, please. So these two lessons learned are also really important, and they connect to that middle layer in that inverted pyramid. Relationships for us set the stage for everything, and addressing power dynamics helps to build relationships and understanding. So when we're talking about relationships, we're talking about relationships between the employers and the consortiums. We're talking about relationships between the employers and the leaders of community organizations, between the employers and job seekers, between us as backbone organization and Indigenous leadership in Winnipeg, between us and the community at large. Like, how are we presenting our initiative? How are we partnering with the community at large? I know that Tamarack and Liz Weaver, I've heard her say several times, change happens at the speed of trust, and we would really agree with that. We would add that we believe that transformation happens at the speed of relationships. And this might seem obvious, relationships, that it's important to have good relationships, but we are bringing together very diverse people, like people from the business community, who very likely have never before had the opportunity to sit down face to face with young Indigenous people who are looking for jobs. So these are very diverse people that we're bringing together, but it's so these relationships are not a given, but when they happen, we found that it's very powerful. So one of the tools that we've used is what we're calling conversation circles. This photo on the right here is during one of these conversation circles. I think we've had 4 of them now. And what we do is we bring together the employers with Indigenous job seekers. And we sit them in circles together on an equal basis. I know one time when we had set this up, we arrived at the community organization, and they had set up a row of tables at the front of the room and said, I guess that's where the employers will be. And we said, no, they're going to be at the tables with the participants, in the circles with the participants. And so what we do then is we have facilitators at each of these circles, and the employers and the participants take turns asking each other questions. We provide them with sort of a cheat sheet of questions, just in case they have mental blocks and they need a little guidance, but they end up asking each other questions like, well, from an employer perspective, questions like, how can we create a work environment that is going to be welcoming to you? What's important to you in a work environment? And the job seekers ask the employers questions like, what do you do when there's a racist comment made? How do you respond to that? Or what happens if I have to go to a cultural activity? How do you deal with that? Or what if I have to go to a funeral and it means traveling way up north and I have to be there for a week? How do you deal with that? So really rich conversations happen out of these. In the end, we talk to the participants. Job seekers are surprised and so appreciative that the employers are interested in them and want to know what they think. And the employers are so gratified to learn how committed these job seekers are to finding a way forward for themselves. They're always impressed by that. So these are important things of building relationships. And also within employer consortiums, relationships are important. as the employers delve into this subject and learn together, they're also developing trust with each other, and they end up sharing problems and successes within their workplaces and problem solving together. I think maybe typically we think that when you put a bunch of different businesses in the same room, that business competitiveness is going to be one of the issues that's in the room. And we found that that really takes the back seat, because what they have in common is really wanting to make this work, and they found that it's helpful to share information, share honestly with each other. And so, and addressing power dynamics is an important way to build relationships. I think we've demonstrated that when, we sit people around a table, when we bring the employers to the community job sites and sit them around the table on an equal basis with the participants, we're addressing those power dynamics, and that's important for building relationships and understanding. Next slide, please. So finally, a lesson learned for us, and as it relates to the inverted diagram, the top row is that we are starting to identify conditions for success as we have experience with this, as employers are starting to try things out and engage Indigenous youth. And we're also uncovering gaps and barriers that are related to policies and practices. I guess an example of that would be that we're learning that there is often a gap between when participants finish their training and when they enter the jobs. So we're calling that the transition support piece, that there needs to be the intensive wraparound support that occurs while they're in training needs to continue beyond the training and into the first segments of the job. So we're just embarking on that issue. We are using tools like the Social Innovation Lab strategies, and we're trying to understand that issue of transition support a little better from everybody's perspective, and we are hoping to use a lab process to try and see if we can figure out some solutions to that. So in summary, I think we would say that that we have found that the FSG model of the 6 conditions for systems change resonates with the TRC 92 initiative. And being conscious of that has helped us understanding why we are approaching things the way we are, how all these factors are important to systems change, even though it takes more time and it's more complicated. The conditions are also very interrelated, we have found, and addressing one has a cascading effect on the others. This is particularly true for the bottom of the pyramid, the mental models, changing mental models, and the relationships and connections, and addressing the power dynamics. Once you create the environment for those things to happen, it opens the door for other things to happen. And all of these are powerful forces for moving an initiative forward. And I think that we will leave it at that and open it up now for conversation.
Thank you, Pam and Erica. That was really illuminating. I think you've highlighted really important points in there. The importance of business engagement and playing a role in truth and reconciliation process. And the importance of relationships really being key. Really it is a process. I am now going to open it up to questions. We got some questions coming through I'm just looking at the chat box right now. If there's any questions coming up, please feel free to unmute yourself for any questions.
I think we see there's a couple of questions in the chat box.
Yeah, okay, I am going to first pull up Nadine's question. There's a couple of questions here. how are these organizations educating themselves on truth and reconciliation effective to Indigenous peoples?
I can try and answer that one. What we're seeing, this is Pam, what we're seeing is organizations looking at different strategies to educate themselves. So they are involved in some of the opportunities that we as the Poverty Reduction Council are coordinating and making available. Things like blanket exercise led by Indigenous individuals and Indigenous businesses based here in the city. Participation in, and you'll have seen on one of the slides that Erica used, we were able to coordinate a conversation with one of the Indigenous leaders that working out of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So being engaged in conversation with Indigenous leaders. They are also, as Erica described, participating in these conversation circles with Indigenous-led organizations training youth for employment and speaking directly with youth. So that's some of the ways they're doing it is in terms of participating in consortium activities. What we're seeing now is that they are approaching their education for their organization in different ways. Some of them are building on what they've learned from things like the blanket exercise and engaging in Indigenous facilitators to meet with first of all, their management teams and take them through a similar learning process. Other things though are and we were sharing this with Elle prior to the start of the webinar today, other things are surfacing as our initiative becomes more familiar or better known across the community. For example, we had an opportunity to approach some of our employer consortium members a couple of weeks ago about the opportunity for them to participate in a panel at the University of Manitoba as part of Indigenous Awareness Week. And the School of Business there and the Indigenous Students Program, it was putting on a panel presentation, and we're wondering if some of consortium members might want to come and engage in that panel. So it was again an opportunity to engage with Indigenous youth, Indigenous students going through the business program and have conversation with them directly. So I think we're looking at different opportunities and some of the ones we know about, like the blanket exercise, but also open to different opportunities. So I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully.
The second question from Nadine is, are these consortiums effective actions to the Indigenous population in and around Winnipeg?
Well, and I guess that's a question we'd have to ask the Indigenous leaders and Indigenous organizations that are involved with that. What we've seen to this point is that as we approach these organizations about being involved with this, as we seek out the opportunities to work with the National Center, the response has been very positive. The opportunity to connect with business in this way and meet in conversation and looking at ways to work together with organizations and sectors that perhaps haven't come together in this way before has been very well received. So our sense to this point is that it has potential to do that, but certainly we need to keep asking that question and making sure that we're working effectively with Indigenous populations, Indigenous leadership.
And I would just add on that one, this is Erica here, as the statistics in one of the first slides show, there's huge demand for jobs, for Indigenous job seekers in Winnipeg. So, and we have some very strong Indigenous-led organizations who are our community training partners and so they have a strong interest in wanting to connect their participants with job opportunities. So they are very happy for any opportunity in that regard. And also, as we said, they very much appreciate the employer consortiums taking the approach of, not coming in as, coming in on an equal basis and sitting down and having conversations with them and with their participants. So we've been, that is very much the approach that our businesses have taken to this point, and our community, Indigenous partners appreciate that kind of approach.
Thank you. I see there's another question in the chat box from Anne, and it says, I'm curious about how you prepare participants for the conversation circles.
So, well, we work with the community organizations. So it starts with the leadership in those community organizations. So, and in fact, the cheat sheet that I mentioned that has the questions on, that was developed with the participants in one of the community organizations. So we found that these community organizations prepare their participants. So we send out this cheat sheet to them beforehand. And we found that what they choose to do is they go through it with their participants beforehand, so the participants can think about it and think about answers to some of these questions, and also think about questions that they might have for the employers. And I know that, we were concerned at the beginning that participants would be reserved and quiet and be, wary about speaking about talking, but we have just found that they've been so open, and we've just been really pleasantly surprised about that. I think it's partly because of the great work that the community organizations have done with them in preparing them for this, and also just building their skills as far as communication and expressing themselves, that kind of thing. So we have some very good community organizations here doing that work.
Also, the employers involved in the circles have shared with us how valuable it has been for them to go through some just sort of general introductory educational opportunities before they engage in these circles. So the opportunity to sit through things like the blanket exercise, to have had a conversation and some introduction to some of the history and legacy of that Indigenous people in our country have experienced. They've sat with Kevin Lamoureux, and who's was a lead at National Centre, and that had been very helpful in preparing them as employers. And one of the things we hadn't shared is when we reached out to employers, the individuals that came forward representing the companies are typically the HR leads. They're either sort of heads of operations or they're the human resource leads in the companies. So that's the individuals that have been coming to the meetings, and they've really appreciated that advance opportunity to educate themselves in terms of terminology, language, and just some of the things that might be important for a respectful conversation.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions people want to ask verbally? There's a couple more questions in the chat box I can read out.
It's Franco here in Calgary.
Hello.
Hi. I just was wondering if I could ask about, in our work here, not specifically to employment, but in terms within the Indigenous communities and people, the use of elders and what role have elders played in all of this work?
That's a good question. We have not, used elders very specifically so far in this work. We have we've consulted a lot with Indigenous leadership, but not so much with elders. It's something that we have in our mind all the time, and we are wondering about ways to incorporate that, but we just haven't to this point.
We do it here at United Way Winnipeg. We do have a Council for Indigenous Relations, which is a group of Indigenous leaders that have been engaged in providing advice and guidance to United Way on a number of issues and strategies that they've undertaken. So one of our early steps was to meet with that group and to explain to them the theory of change we were thinking about, and to seek their guidance and advice on how we might move forward with that. In talking with that group, that council, and with others, as Erica described in the community, some of the most emphasized advice we had was meet with youth. And I noticed there's a question in the chat box about meeting with those with lived experience. One of the questions we got, well, have you spoken with youth? And at that point, we hadn't. we'd spoken with business, we'd spoken with community training organizations and the executive directors of those, but we hadn't gone directly to youth. So that was a really important step for us. And as your question suggests, thinking about how we more effectively incorporate elders and that sort of guidance and wisdom into this process is really important. So
we're also fortunate to have a staff person for United Way, Indigenous. Her role. What is her title again? Sorry, Indigenous Relations Manager, Director.
Yep.
And we rely on her a lot as far as providing direction and connections and resources and that kind of thing. So as far as explicitly elders, not well, except that we've organized some blanket exercises, 2 of them so far, and one of them incorporated an elder as well. So in that way, I guess we have.
Thank you. You commented on one of the questions in the chat box already. I'll read it out from Lynn. I am always curious if there are suggestions as to how best to engage with lived or living experience. I have found that it is hard to, as many clients have engaged before and haven't seen any positive results, and rightly so. We do have a resource that we'll share towards the end that might be interesting. Any further comments towards that?
Yeah, we really appreciate that question, and certainly in starting down the journey that is this initiative, one of the concerns that we had was about the notion of making connections between employers and youth and having it not be a successful experience for either. And so early on, and I think this really relates back to those 6 conditions that we've been talking about, we realized that it was more than just making connections. It was creating the sustainable or transformative change that would result in opportunities for sustainable and meaningful employment on both sides, from the employer's perspective and from the job-seeking youth perspective. So when we talked about that, and employers actually rightly so said, we're not ready to meet with potential employees yet. We need to educate ourselves. We need to think about our own learning, and we need to think about whether our workplace is at a point where we are ready to offer culturally sensitive opportunity to youth. So I think a lot of that work had to happen out front, and we did a lot of talking and thinking about that in advance of even connecting with youth. And that's why often, as we'll get the question about, so how many youth are employed? And those numbers are small right now. But our thinking is that what we're doing is we're working to create that sustainable, or support that sustainable or transformative change that will result in workplaces and practices or methods of engaging youth with lived experience that will result in hopefully more positive outcomes for all involved.
Thank you. I see Catherine has a couple questions here. So what was it about the 6 conditions that was so helpful to your work?
Well, I think it was more that it was affirming to our work, because I mean it just feels like it just fits exactly with our work. And I think the main thing probably is, like, we are taking this very slow, iterative process, and it just sort of affirmed that we can't just plunk people in jobs, that there is relationship building that needs to take place, that there is power imbalances that need to be addressed, that there are policy probably barriers within companies that need to be addressed. So it just was something that just resonated with our initiative. We very much agree that we are all about systems change, but we are just looking at policy and resource flows and that kind of thing. We are missing the boat. That's very clear with our project.
Okay, and she's got a second part to this around what were the challenges and our weaknesses in applying and working with the 6 conditions of systems change model?
I think the big challenge really is what we're embarking on now, which is moving up to that third row, the policy change piece. You know, we've been so pleased by the way the relationship building has gone. It's been much easier than we probably would have anticipated and much more powerful, I guess. But the challenge now is, how are we going to make this concrete? Right? How are we going to, we've identified some barriers through all this relationship building. Now, how can we solve those problems? And how can we seriously make an impact on Indigenous employment in Winnipeg? That's really the goal. And how can we do this in a big way eventually? So that's the big challenge right now, and it's not easy, but we're really I think we're really encouraged by sort of the background work that we've done as far as the partnerships we've developed, including, and we should say that on the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council itself, we have representatives from the government, from all levels of government, actually, and from other influencers in the community. And so we are hopeful that those people around the table are going to be helpful as far as making some of these bigger changes that may need to occur.
Great. We have a few more minutes. Does anyone else have a question? I see there's another one in the chat box. I just thought I'd give anyone an opportunity to speak if they have a burning question. Okay, we'll go with one last question in the chat box. This is from Lee. Do you have an example within the arts and culture circles regarding discussion and transformation?
Oh, I don't know. Do we, Pam?
I can't think of any specific examples that related to the 6 conditions.
Not as far as what we are doing. You know, I think that's an interesting question. I think this model of systems change could be translated to many different sectors, including arts and culture. But as far as examples that we have, I can't think of any right now.
Sure. Something to think about.
Yeah, I could, you know what, thinking about challenges, I think we could talk about another one, and that is, you know, we've also been really gratified by, as we said, the education piece for the leadership in the corporation. They've been very receptive to that, and it's made a huge difference to learn about Indigenous education. But it's a real challenge for the companies knowing how to incorporate that into their workplaces, for some of the companies at least. I mean, we're talking about big companies with many hundreds of employees. And in order to incorporate this kind of learning, that they are creating workplaces that are going to be culturally safer for Indigenous job seekers, it requires commitment right from the top down. So different companies are at different places with that, but some are finding real challenges with knowing how to do meaningful education within their workplaces. And it's something that we talk about at our employer consortium meetings and try and help them problem solve and learn from each other around that. So that would be another challenge.
Okay, great, thanks. I think we will move on as we only have a few more minutes. If people want to learn more about today's topic, you can visit the website, the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council website. There's a youth employment video and also the case study that is up on our website, and it's been featured in our newsletter on Illuminating Systems Change in Winnipeg. So all of those links will be provided for you afterwards. And also, if you want to read more on the 6 conditions of systems change, the FSG links will be provided as well. I'd also like to draw your attention to the new resource. Most of you have probably heard about this, and this is the new 10 guide for engaging people with lived and living experience. So this, again, the link will be provided, but most of you will have received this information already. And upcoming learning opportunities. So the next webinar that all of you will have been invited to is on April 24th on Poverty Mythbusters, and that webinar will introduce the City of New Westminster's Poverty Mythbusters, and it's a webinar with Tristan Johnson. And he'll speak to the city's approach to this report, their inspiration, and to data collection and dissemination strategies. So next convener calls. The next Eastern and Western convener calls will be held on the same day, May 9th. And just a note for the Eastern convener call that that date has been changed from the 7th of May to May 9th. And there are also some upcoming Tamarack events in May. And there's more information on our website for that. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today and extend a special thanks to Pam and Erica for sharing their really sharing their experience and offering valuable insight into applying the systems change lens to collective impact work. Many thanks. Thanks everyone for joining us, and today's recording will be emailed to you along with a copy of the presentation. Let me know if you have any questions. You can email me at l@tamarackcommunity.ca. Thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye. Sounds like everyone's leaving now.